The spring afternoon sunlight poured through the beveled glass windows of Maximilian Ashford's custom-built barouche as it rolled through Mayfair's crowded streets. The carriage itself was a masterpiece of craftsmanship. Imported Italian leather seats in deep burgundy, brass fittings polished to mirror brightness, and the Ashford ducal crest emblazoned in gold leaf on both doors. The matched pair of Cleveland bays pulling the carriage were worth more than most gentlemen earned in 5 years. Their coats gleaming like polished mahogany, their movements synchronized with the precision that came from months of expensive training. Inside, Maximilian sat with his back straight against the plush cushions, one hand resting on the carved mahogany armrest, the other holding the latest correspondence from his solicitor regarding the railway investments that had doubled his already considerable fortune in the past 18 months. At 32, the Duke of Ashford was everything society expected of a man in his position. Wealthy beyond measure, ruthlessly intelligent in business matters, and impeccably dressed in a charcoal morning coat cut by Poole & Co. on Savile Row, with a waistcoat of silver brocade that caught the light each time he moved. But it was the woman beside him who drew the eye of every passer-by who glimpsed inside the carriage's open windows. Lady Victoria Pemberton was, by any measure, perfection made flesh. At 24, she possessed the kind of beauty that launched 1,000 whispered conversations in London drawing room. Golden hair, arranged in an elaborate coiffure that had taken her lady's maid 2 hours to perfect, porcelain skin that had never known the kiss of direct sunlight, and eyes the colour of summer sapphires that sparkled with genuine intelligence rather than vacant prettiness. Her gown was the latest Paris fashion, a day dress of cream silk with delicate rose embroidery at the collar and cuffs, the kind of garment that cost what a shopkeeper's family might live on for a year. She was desired by every eligible nobleman in England. 3 earls, 2 marquesses, and 1 particularly persistent viscount had proposed to her in the past season alone. She had refused them all with such gracious diplomacy that none had felt genuinely rejected, merely acknowledged as unsuitable for reasons they couldn't quite articulate. But she had accepted Maximilian, and in doing so, had made him the envy of every man in their social sphere. "The Hertford's ball next week," Victoria was saying, her voice carrying the cultured tones of someone educated by the finest governesses and finished at the most exclusive seminary. "I've already spoken with the modiste about my gown. Something in emerald, I think, to complement the Ashford emeralds you mentioned showing me." Maximilian felt himself smile, a real smile, not the practiced expression he wore at business meetings or political gatherings. This was what he had been seeking for the past year, a woman who understood the demands of his position without making demands of her own, who appreciated the trappings of wealth without requiring constant emotional reassurance, who could grace his table, manage his households, and navigate society with effortless skill, all while leaving him free to focus on the empire he was building. "The emeralds will suit you perfectly," he said, meaning it. "They've been locked in the vault since my mother's death. It's time they were worn by someone who understands their value." Victoria's pleased smile told him he had said exactly the right thing. This was the dance they had perfected over their 3-month courtship, compliments that acknowledged her worth without veering into the maudlin sentimentality he found exhausting, appreciation without suffocation, partnership without the overwhelming intimacy that had destroyed his previous attempt at matrimony, his previous marriage. The thought appeared unbidden, and Maximilian pushed it away with practiced efficiency. That had been a mistake, a moment of weakness when he had allowed emotion to override reason, a secret ceremony that had lasted barely 3 weeks before he had come to his senses and sought an annulment, clean, legal, and buried so deep in legal documents that society had never even known it existed. Ancient history, a lesson learned, nothing more. "The traffic seems worse than usual today," Victoria, peering through the window with mild curiosity rather than impatience. Even her tolerance for London's inconveniences was perfectly calibrated, aware enough to comment, untroubled enough not to complain. Maximilian glanced out his own window and saw that she was right. The street ahead was clogged with vehicles, carriages, delivery wagons, a mail coach that had apparently lost a wheel and was being manoeuvred to the side of the road by 4 cursing men. His driver had brought the barouche to a complete stop, and the sounds of the city poured in through the open windows. Street vendors calling their wares, the clop of dozens of horses' hooves on cobblestones, the general cacophony of London in full afternoon bustle. Shouldn't be more than a few minutes, Maximilian said, folding his solicitor's letter and tucking it into the inner pocket of his coat. He had learned to use such delays productively, time to think, to plan, to consider the next business venture or political alliance. But Victoria had turned her attention to the street scene outside, and Maximilian found himself following her gaze with idle interest. This was Mayfair, the heart of fashionable London, where the wealthy and well-born congregated in their natural habitat. The pedestrians passing by their stopped carriage were dressed accordingly, gentlemen in tailored morning coats, ladies in elaborate day dresses, servants in livery marking them as belonging to the great houses. And then he saw her. She was walking on the opposite side of the street, moving carefully through the crowd, and even from a distance, even after more than a year, Maximilian recognized her instantly. Some part of his brain catalogued the details with painful clarity, the way she held her shoulders, the particular tilt of her head, the careful, measured pace of someone carrying something precious. Arabella, his annulled wife, the woman he had married in a moment of passion and discarded in a moment of panic. But it was what she carried, who she carried, that made Maximilian's breath stop entirely in his chest. 2 babies, twins, clearly, bundled in matching blankets of soft blue and pink, a boy and a girl. If the traditional color coding held true, they couldn't be more than a year old, perhaps less, their small faces just visible beneath carefully arranged bonnets. Beside Arabella walked a maid, no one Maximilian recognized, dressed in simple but clean servant's attire, carrying what appeared to be a basket of supplies. The maid was speaking to Arabella with the kind of familiar ease that suggested long acquaintance, occasionally reaching over to adjust one of the baby's blankets when the wind threatened to disturb them. Arabella herself looked different from the woman Maximilian remembered. Thinner, perhaps, her face showing the kind of exhaustion that came from sleepless nights and constant worry. Her dress was respectable but modest, not the fashions of Mayfair, but the practical clothing of someone who had to consider the cost of fabric and the durability of seams. Her auburn hair was arranged simply beneath a bonnet that had seen better days, and she carried herself with a careful dignity that suggested she was acutely aware of her reduced circumstances. But it was the babies that held Maximilian's attention. Even from across the street, even through the crowd of pedestrians and the haze of city air, he could see enough to make his heart begin to hammer against his ribs with sick certainty. The boy had dark hair, Maximilian's dark hair, and when the child turned his head slightly, fussing against his mother's shoulder, the profile was unmistakable, the strong Ashford jawline that appeared in portraits going back 6 generations. The girl was harder to see, tucked more securely against Arabella's chest, but when she shifted, Maximilian caught a glimpse of eyes that were startlingly light, even at this distance. Grey eyes, Ashford eyes, the same unusual shade that stared back at him from his shaving mirror each morning. The mathematics were inescapable, brutal in their simplicity. He had married Arabella in secret 15 months ago. A rushed ceremony in a small chapel, witnessed by strangers, driven by emotion, he had later convinced himself was temporary insanity. They had been together for 3 weeks. 3 weeks of a marriage that had terrified him with its intensity, with the way she had looked at him as if he were someone worth loving rather than merely useful to know. 3 weeks before he had panicked, before the weight of domestic expectation had felt like a noose tightening around his throat, before he had sought legal counsel and discovered that an annulment could erase those 3 weeks as if they had never happened, as if she had never been his wife, as if he had never made promises he wasn't capable of keeping. The annulment had been finalized 13 months ago, and those babies looked to be approximately 3 or 4 months old. The timing was perfect, horribly, undeniably perfect. Maximilian, Victoria's voice seemed to come from very far away. Is something wrong? You've gone quite pale. He couldn't answer, couldn't tear his eyes away from the sight of Arabella adjusting the boy's blanket with the kind of practiced efficiency that spoke to months of experience. The maid said something that made Arabella smile, a tired smile but genuine, and Maximilian felt something crack open in his chest that he had thought was safely sealed away. She had been pregnant when he annulled their marriage. She must have been. The timing allowed for no other possibility, and she had never told him, had never sent word, never demanded support, never threatened to expose the secret marriage that society had never even known about. She had simply disappeared from his life as completely as if the annulment had erased her very existence, and she had carried his children, his son and daughter, alone. The traffic began to clear. The mail coach was finally moved aside, and Maximilian's driver called softly to the horses, preparing to move forward. In moments, they would be past this spot, continuing on to whatever engagement Victoria had planned for the afternoon. Maximilian's hand shot out to grip the window frame, his knuckles going white with the force of his grip. Across the street, Arabella was turning down a side street, the maid following close behind, both women and both babies disappearing into the afternoon crowd. "Stop the carriage," Maximilian heard himself say, the words emerging rough and urgent. "Your Grace?" His driver's confused voice filtered down from the box. "Stop the carriage. Now." Victoria was staring at him with open concern, one gloved hand reaching toward him as if to check for fever. "Maximilian, what is it? What's wrong?" But Maximilian couldn't explain, couldn't find words for the chaos erupting inside him, fury and guilt and bone-deep certainty all tangled together. He had children, a son and a daughter, and the woman he had discarded like an unwanted business contract was raising them alone, struggling through London streets in worn clothing, while he sat in a carriage worth more than most houses. The carriage came to a halt. Maximilian reached for the door handle, some wild impulse driving him to follow her, to demand explanations, to what? 'Cause a scene in the middle of Mayfair, abandon his fiancée without explanation, chase after a woman he had made very clear he wanted nothing to do with. His hand fell away from the door. The moment passed. Logic reasserted itself with painful force. "I apologize," he said, forcing his voice back to something approaching normal. "I thought I saw... It was nothing. A mistake. But it wasn't nothing, and it wasn't a mistake." And as the carriage rolled forward, leaving Arabella and his children behind, Maximilian knew with absolute certainty that the carefully constructed life he had been building, the perfect fiancée, the emotional distance, the freedom from domestic complications, had just shattered as completely as if someone had taken a hammer to a fine crystal. Because somewhere in London, walking through streets he owned half the buildings on, was a woman he had married and abandoned, and she was raising his children without him. The question wasn't whether he could ignore this discovery and continue with his planned future. The question was whether he was brave enough to face what he had done, and whether Arabella would ever forgive him enough to let him try to make it right. Continuing video 40. Full story. Victoria's voice cut through Maximilian's spiraling thoughts with the precision of a well-aimed blade. "You're certain you're well. You look as though you've seen a ghost." The observation was too accurate to be comfortable. Maximilian forced himself to breathe normally, to settle back against the leather cushions, to present the composed facade that had served him so well in business negotiations and political maneuvering. But his mind was racing, cataloguing every detail of what he had just witnessed, calculating timelines with the same ruthless precision he brought to financial projections. "Merely a headache," he said, the lie coming easily after years of practice at concealing inconvenient emotions. The heat, perhaps, nothing of consequence. Victoria studied him with those intelligent sapphire eyes, and Maximilian could see her weighing whether to press the matter. This was what made her so suitable as a duchess. She understood when to inquire and when to allow a man his privacy. After a moment, she nodded and returned her attention to the passing scenery, though her hand remained on his arm in a gesture of silent support. The rest of the journey to the Hertfords' townhouse, where they had been expected for afternoon tea, passed in a blur. Maximilian participated in conversation with mechanical precision, his responses appropriate but empty, his attention fractured between the social niceties required of him and the image burned into his mind of Arabella's tired face, and those two small bundles she carried with such obvious. By the time they departed the Hertfords 3 hours later, Maximilian had made a decision that would have appalled his younger self. The man who had sought an annulment to escape the suffocating weight of matrimonial expectations would have counselled avoidance, distance, the careful preservation of the life he had constructed with such deliberate care. But that man had not seen his children in the street, had not witnessed the evidence of consequences he had convinced himself didn't exist. After depositing Victoria at her family's Belgrave Square residence, enduring her concerned inquiries about his continued pallor with promises to rest and consult his physician, Maximilian directed his driver to take him not to his Grosvenor Square mansion, but to the offices of Thornbury and Associates, the most discreet investigators in London. The firm occupied the third floor of an unremarkable building in Holborn, far from the fashionable quarters where Maximilian normally conducted his business. Mr. Cornelius Thornbury himself received the Duke in his private office, a room that smelled of old paper and expensive tobacco, its walls lined with filing cabinets that presumably held the secrets of half of London's upper classes. "Your Grace," Thornbury said, his voice carrying the careful neutrality of a man who had learned never to show surprise at his client's requests. He was perhaps 60, with iron-grey hair and shrewd eyes that had witnessed enough human folly to make him unshockable. "How may I be of service?" Maximilian settled into the chair across from Thornbury's desk, feeling the weight of what he was about to set in motion. This was a line he was crossing, an invasion of privacy that spoke to everything he had once despised about the aristocracy's casual disregard for those with less power. But the alternative, spending the rest of his life not knowing, was unthinkable. "I need information about a woman," Maximilian said, forcing the words past the guilt that tried to choke them off. Discreetly, quickly, and completely. "See." Thornbury pulled a leather-bound notebook from his desk drawer and uncapped his fountain pen with practiced efficiency. "Name? Arabella Sinclair, or possibly Arabella Ashford, depending on what legal status she claims." The use of his own surname in that context sent a jolt through Maximilian's system. Had she kept it, or had she reverted to her maiden name after the annulment, erasing their brief union as thoroughly as the legal documents had? Age? 29. Auburn hair, grey-green eyes, approximately 5 feet 6 inches in height. Maximilian heard his own voice cataloguing details and realized with uncomfortable clarity that he remembered everything about her, not just her physical appearance, but the way she laughed, the particular tilt of her head when she was thinking, the serious expression she wore when reading that made her look younger than her years. Last known address? This was where Maximilian's knowledge ran dry. When he had last seen Arabella, the morning after their annulment was finalized, when she had stood in the doorway of the small house in Chelsea, where they had briefly played at being married, she had been living in modest circumstances, but not poverty. The house belonged to a friend, she had said. Temporary lodgings while she decided what to do next. He had offered her money, a settlement that would ensure her comfort. It had seemed generous at the time, even noble, providing for a woman he had technically never been married to in the eyes of society, ensuring she wouldn't suffer financially from their mistake. She had refused every shilling with a dignity that had made him feel smaller than all his wealth and title combined. "I don't know her current direction," Maximilian admitted, "but I saw her this afternoon in Mayfair, near Berkeley Square. She was on foot, with a maid, and—" He paused, the next words requiring physical effort to speak aloud. "And she was carrying 2 infants, twins, I believe, a boy and a girl, approximately 3 to 4 months of age." Thornbury's pen stilled for just a moment, the only indication that this information was noteworthy. When he resumed writing, his voice remained professionally neutral. "And you wish to know everything, where she's living, how she's supporting herself, the circumstances of the children's birth." Maximilian leaned forward, his hands gripping the arms of his chair. "I need to know if those children are mine." There. The words were spoken aloud, given substance and reality. No more pretending this was idle curiosity or accidental interest. This was a father, potentially a father, demanding to know about his children. Thornbury set down his pen and regarded Maximilian with the kind of level assessment that suggested he had heard similar requests many times before. "Your Grace, questions of paternity are delicate matters. Even with my resources, I cannot produce certainty where biology and discretion intersect. What I can provide is circumstantial evidence, birth records, timelines, witness accounts, but absolute proof. I understand. Do what you can. I need answers within 48 hours. That's extremely expedited. I'll pay triple your usual rates." Money, as always, smoothed the way. Thornbury nodded once, closing his notebook with finality. "You'll have my report by Thursday afternoon. Where shall I deliver it?" "To my private study. No one else is to see it. Not my secretary, not my butler, no one. Deliver it directly to me or not at all." After departing Thornbury's office, Maximilian found himself walking rather than summoning his carriage. The evening air was cool against his face, and he needed time to think before returning to his Grosvenor Square mansion, where servants would be waiting with dinner preparations and correspondence requiring his attention. The walk took him through streets that transformed from commercial Holborn to the elegant squares and crescents of Mayfair, each step taking him further into the world of wealth and privilege that he had been born into and had expanded through ruthless business acumen. His townhouse occupied the entire south side of Grosvenor Square, a 4-story testament to Ashford family power that had been in the family for 3 generations. The facade was Portland stone, the windows topped with elaborate cornices, the front door flanked by columns that had been imported from Italy at staggering expense. Inside, the entrance hall soared 2 stories, its walls covered in silk damask, the colour of old gold. A chandelier that had cost more than most men earned in a lifetime hung from the ceiling, its crystal prisms catching the light from dozens of candles. Marble flooring, inlaid in geometric patterns that required 3 craftsmen 6 months to complete, led to a grand staircase with an ornately carved balustrade. This was wealth, not the comfortable prosperity of the gentry, but the kind of excessive fortune that inspired awe and envy in equal measure. Every room Maximilian walked through held treasures, paintings by old masters, furniture crafted by the finest artisans in Europe, carpets woven by hand in workshops that supplied royalty. And somewhere in London, Arabella was living in circumstances modest enough that her clothing showed wear and her single servant was a maid rather than the retinue a duchess would. His duchess. Technically, legally, perhaps she still was. The annulment had been based on non-consummation, a legal fiction that both parties had agreed to support. But that fiction was demonstrably false if those children were his. An annulment obtained through falsehood could be challenged, overturned, declared void, which would mean that for the past 13 months, while Maximilian had been courting Victoria and rebuilding his carefully controlled life, he had actually been a married man whose wife was raising his children alone. The implications made his head spin. Branwell, his butler, appeared in the doorway of Maximilian's study as if summoned by thought alone. The man had served the Ashford family for 40 years and possessed the supernatural ability all great butlers cultivated, the capacity to anticipate needs before they were spoken. Your Grace, dinner is prepared whenever you wish it, and Lady Victoria's maid delivered a note asking you to confirm tomorrow's engagement at the opera. Tomorrow, the opera. Victoria, in another exquisite gown, seated in the Ashford box, drawing every eye in the house. The life he had planned, unfolding with perfect predictability, except now he knew that life was built on a foundation of ignorance, of deliberate blindness to consequences he had convinced himself didn't exist. Tell the kitchen I'll dine in my study, and send word to Lady Victoria that I'll collect her at 7 as planned. After Bramwell withdrew, Maximilian poured himself 3 fingers of Balvenie single malt from the crystal decanter on his sideboard, a whiskey that cost more per bottle than most families spent on food in a month, and settled into the leather chair behind his massive mahogany desk. The study was his sanctuary, the one room in the house that reflected his personal taste rather than generations of Ashford tradition. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves held his collection of first editions and rare manuscripts. Gas lamps provided steady light for the late-night work sessions that had built his business empire, and on the wall behind his desk hung the only portrait in the house that Maximilian had commissioned himself, not of an ancestor or family member, but of the coal mine in Northumberland that had been his first major investment, the foundation of the fortune he had built independent of his inherited wealth. He had been so proud of that independence, of proving that he was more than just a title and an ancient name, of building something that belonged entirely to him, that couldn't be claimed by duty or family obligation. But independence had come at a cost he was only now beginning to calculate. Maximilian pulled open the bottom drawer of his desk, the one secured with a lock to which only he held the key. Inside, buried beneath business documents and legal papers, was a small leather box. He had told himself for 13 months that he had kept it for purely practical reasons. It contained items of value that should be properly stored. But as he opened the box and looked at its contents, Maximilian couldn't pretend anymore that practicality had anything to do with it. A simple gold wedding band, sized for a woman's hand. Arabella's ring, left behind in the Chelsea house the morning they parted. He had found it on the kitchen table, alongside a brief note written in her careful handwriting. "Keep it. I have no use for symbols of promises that were never meant to be kept." Beside the ring lay a small daguerreotype, the only image he had of her. It had been taken by a street photographer during their brief marriage, captured on an afternoon when they had walked through Hyde Park, like any ordinary couple. Arabella was laughing in the image, her face lit with unguarded joy, looking at Maximilian rather than the camera. He couldn't remember what he had said to make her laugh, couldn't recall the specific moment, but he remembered the feeling of those 3 weeks. The terrifying, exhilarating sensation of being with someone who saw past his title and his wealth to the person underneath. Someone who had argued with him about politics and philosophy, who had read poetry aloud in the evenings, who had made him feel as though he were more than just the sum of his achievements. Someone who had frightened him so badly that he had destroyed everything rather than risk becoming vulnerable. Maximilian closed the box with a sharp snap and returned it to its drawer, locking away the evidence of his greatest mistake. But the image of Arabella in the street with those 2 babies remained burned into his mind, refusing to be locked away or forgotten. Somewhere in this vast city, his children were sleeping in a house he didn't know, cared for by a woman who had every reason to hate him, and he had no idea whether she would ever let him near them, or whether he deserved that chance, even if she would. The next 48 hours, waiting for Thornbury's report, felt like the longest of Maximilian's life. He attended the opera with Victoria, watching her sparkling social performance from what felt like a great distance, unable to focus on the music or the spectacle. He met with his business associates, reviewed contracts for a new railway line, attended a session at the House of Lords, all while his mind churned endlessly through calculations and possibilities. Victoria noticed his distraction, of course. How could she not? But she approached it with her characteristic grace, asking gentle questions about his health, suggesting he might benefit from a few days in the country, never demanding explanations he wasn't prepared to give. And with every gracious gesture, every thoughtful inquiry, Maximilian felt the weight of his deception growing heavier. He was engaged to a woman who deserved honesty, while harboring secrets that would destroy their careful courtship. He was planning a future that depended on a past that might not even be legally resolved. Thursday afternoon arrived with agonizing slowness. Maximilian dismissed his secretary early, claiming he needed privacy for sensitive correspondence. Then he sat in his study and waited, every sound in the house making him start with anticipation. When Branwell finally knocked at precisely 3 o'clock, announcing, "Mr. Thornbury, to see you, Your Grace," Maximilian felt his heart hammer against his ribs. With such force, he wondered if he was suffering some kind of cardiac episode. Thornbury entered with the same professional neutrality he had displayed at their first meeting, carrying a leather portfolio that presumably contained the information Maximilian had paid so handsomely to obtain. He set the portfolio on Maximilian's desk with the careful deliberation of someone delivering something both valuable and dangerous. "Your Grace, I have the information you requested." And Maximilian couldn't keep the urgency from his voice. Thornbury opened the portfolio, withdrawing several documents and photographs that he arranged on the desk with methodical precision. "Mrs. Arabella Ashford. She retained your name after the annulment, though she goes by Mrs. and allows society to assume she's a widow. Currently resides at 14 Montague Street in Bloomsbury, a modest neighbourhood, respectable but not fashionable. She rents the upper 2 floors of a house owned by a Mrs. Dorothy Fletcher, a widow herself who apparently provides occasional assistance with the children." Maximilian's hands gripped the edge of his desk. The children, born 4 months ago at University College Hospital. A boy registered as Theodore James Ashford and a girl registered as Caroline Grace Ashford. Both births were attended by the same physician, Dr. Marcus Whitley, and both children are listed with your name as their father on the birth certificate. The world seemed to tilt sideways. Maximilian reached for one of the photographs Thornbury had placed on the desk, a clear image of Arabella leaving her lodgings, carrying both infants, their faces visible enough to confirm what he already knew in his bones. Theodore had his eyes. Caroline had the distinctive Ashford chin. There was no doubt, no possibility of coincidence. "Financial circumstances?" Maximilian forced himself to ask, though guilt was already choking him. "Precarious," Thornbury said bluntly. "Mrs. Ashford supports herself through needlework. She takes in sewing and embroidery commissions from a shop in Covent Garden. The income is barely sufficient for rent, food, and basic necessities. She has no other visible means of support, no family assistance, no mysterious benefactors. I offered her money," Maximilian said, more to himself than to Thornbury, "after the annulment, a generous settlement. She refused it, according to my inquiries. The landlady mentioned that Mrs. Ashford is proud, insists on paying her own way, and accepts no charity. Pride. The same pride that had made her refuse his initial offer had apparently sustained her through a pregnancy and 4 months of single motherhood, even as she struggled to feed herself and her children. "Is there anything else?" Maximilian asked, though he wasn't certain he could bear any more revelations. Thornbury hesitated, which was unusual enough to make Maximilian look up sharply. "There is one additional matter, Your Grace. The annulment." "What about it?" The legal basis for the annulment was non-consummation of the marriage. However, the existence of children born within the proper time frame to be products of that union renders that claim demonstrably false. In legal terms, the annulment was obtained through fraud, not intentional fraud perhaps, if Mrs. Ashford was unaware of her pregnancy at the time, but fraud nonetheless. The implications crashed over Maximilian like a wave. Which means that your marriage to Mrs. Ashford may still be legally valid. If she chose to challenge the annulment, citing the children as evidence that consummation did occur, a court would likely rule in her favour. You would be, in the eyes of the law, a married man, and your engagement to Lady Victoria would be bigamy, Maximilian finished, the word tasting like ash in his mouth. Thornbury nodded gravely. "I've taken the liberty of consulting with several legal experts discreetly. The consensus is that if Mrs. Ashford wished to press the matter, she would have an extremely strong case. The fact that she has not done so suggests either ignorance of her legal position or a deliberate choice not to pursue it." After Thornbury departed, Maximilian sat alone in his study for hours. The portfolio of information spread before him, like evidence at a trial. Photographs of Arabella struggling with 2 babies and a basket of groceries, records showing her employment at a shop that paid barely enough to survive, birth certificates naming him as father to 2 children he had never held, never seen beyond a glimpse from a carriage window. He was a father, not potentially, not probably, but definitively. Theodore and Caroline Ashford were his children, growing up in a Bloomsbury lodging house while he lived in a Mayfair mansion with more rooms than he could even count. And Arabella, his wife, legally still his wife, was struggling to feed them on seamstress wages while he accumulated wealth faster than he could spend it. The injustice of it, the sheer wrongness, sat like a stone in Maximilian's chest, but underneath the guilt was something else, something he hadn't expected to feel. Relief, almost joy. He had children, a son who carried his name, a daughter who had his mother's eyes, pieces of himself walking around in the world, learning and growing and existing without his knowledge. The question wasn't whether to acknowledge them. That much was obvious, unavoidable, necessary. The question was whether Arabella would allow him anywhere near them after what he had done, whether she would accept his help now when she had refused it so proudly before, whether he had destroyed any chance of being part of their lives through his cowardice 13 months ago. Only one way to find out. Maximilian pulled out a fresh sheet of his personal stationery, heavy cream paper embossed with the Ashford crest, and began to write. "Mrs. Ashford, I saw you on Tuesday in Mayfair. I know about Theodore and Caroline. I know that I am their father. We must speak immediately. I will call upon you tomorrow at 2 o'clock at your lodgings in Montague Street. If this time is inconvenient, send word and name another time that suits you. But we will speak, Arab. You cannot keep my children from me any longer. Maximilian." He sealed the letter before he could reconsider its harsh tone, before he could soften the demand into a request. Arabella had made her choices. Now it was time for Maximilian to make his. The letter was delivered by private courier that evening. Maximilian paced his study until midnight, half expecting an immediate response, some angry rejection of his demand. But no reply came, which meant tomorrow, at 2 o'clock, he would stand on the doorstep of a Bloomsbury lodging house and face the woman he had married and abandoned, and somehow he would have to convince her that the man who had been too cowardly to be a husband was ready to try being a father. The question was whether he could convince himself of the same thing. Continuing to completion, 14 Montague Street was a world away from Grosvenor Square in every sense that mattered. The street itself was respectable enough, neat brick houses with clean steps and modest window boxes, but it possessed none of the imposing grandeur that marked the homes of the truly wealthy. These were the dwellings of the upper working class and lower middle class, of clerks and shopkeepers, and genteel widows living on small annuities. Respectable poverty, if such a thing existed. Maximilian's carriage drew stairs as it rolled to a stop in front of number 14. The crest on the door was unmistakable, and he could see curtains twitching in neighbouring windows as residents marked the arrival of a duke in their modest quarter. The gossip would be fierce by evening. Speculation about which resident had attracted such elevated attention. Let them gossip. Maximilian was past caring about discretion. He climbed the stairs to the entrance with a sense of inevitability, as if every step of his life had been leading to this moment. The building's front door opened onto a narrow hallway with stairs leading upward. A card beside the second door read, "Mrs. D. Fletcher, landlady," in careful copperplate script. The upper floors, Thornbury had belonged to Arabella. Maximilian climbed the stairs, his hand trailing along a banister that was clean but worn, the wood smoothed by decades of use. At the top landing, 2 doors faced him. He knocked on the left one, the sound seeming unnaturally loud in the quiet house. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then he heard footsteps, a woman's light tread, and the door opened. Arabella stood in the doorway, and the sight of her hit Maximilian with physical force. She was thinner than he remembered, her face showing the exhaustion of months of inadequate sleep and constant worry. Her dress was clean but worn, mended carefully at the cuffs. Her auburn hair was pulled back simply, without the elaborate styling that ladies of fashion employed. But her eyes, those grey-green eyes that had haunted his dreams, held the same intelligence and strength he remembered, along with something new. A fierce protectiveness that made her seem simultaneously more vulnerable and more formidable than the woman he had married. "Your Grace," she said, her voice carefully neutral. No warmth, but no overt hostility either. Just the formal acknowledgement one might give any titled visitor. "I received your letter. May I come in?" Arabella hesitated, and Maximilian could see her weighing the decision. Propriety dictated she should refuse. An unmarried woman, or widow, as society believed her, entertaining a gentleman alone was scandalous. But practicality and the weight of what needed to be discussed apparently won out. She stepped back, opening the door wider. "The children are sleeping," she said quietly. "If you wake them, you'll leave immediately. They've only just settled." It was a warning and a mother's fierce edict all at once. Maximilian nodded and stepped inside. The rooms were small, but scrupulously clean. The main living area served as a sitting room, dining room, and workspace all at once. A worn but comfortable settee faced a modest fireplace. A table by the window held sewing supplies, neat stacks of fabric, spools of thread arranged by colour, several pieces in various states of completion. A rocking chair sat near the fire, its cushion indented from frequent use. But it was the corner near the bedroom door that captured Maximilian's attention completely. A large wooden cradle, handmade clearly, the craftsmanship simple but sturdy, held 2 sleeping forms. He moved toward it as if pulled by invisible strings, his feet carrying him forward before conscious thought could intervene. Theodore and Caroline, his son and daughter. They slept facing each other, their small hands touching in the centre of the cradle, in a gesture that suggested they took comfort from each other's presence, even in sleep. Theodore was larger, more solid, with dark hair that curled slightly at the edges. Caroline was smaller, more delicate, with auburn hair so light it was almost blonde. Both had the Ashford features. Both were unmistakably his children. Maximilian's hands trembled as he gripped the edge of the cradle, staring at these small people who had emerged into the world without his knowledge, who had spent 4 months of their lives unaware that their father existed at all. "They're beautiful," he said, his voice coming out rough with emotion he couldn't contain. "Arabella, they're—" "Don't." Her voice cut through his words with cold precision. "Don't you dare stand there and tell me how beautiful they are, as if you have any right to an opinion about them, as if you've earned the privilege of admiring children you knew nothing about until 4 days ago." Maximilian turned to face her, and the fury in her eyes was like a physical blow. This was not the gentle woman he had married. This was a mother whose cubs had been threatened, whose fierce love had transformed her into something harder and more dangerous than the sheltered girl who had once believed his promises. "You didn't tell me," he said, and knew immediately it was the wrong thing to say. "When the annulment was finalized, you must have known—" "I suspected," Arabella interrupted, her voice sharp enough to cut. "I wasn't certain until 6 weeks later. By then, you had made your feelings about domestic entanglements abundantly clear. I had a right to know. You had a right to nothing. Arabella moved to place herself between Maximilian and the cradle, a human barrier between him and the children. You sought an annulment, Maximilian. You couldn't bear being married for 3 weeks. 3 weeks. Before you ran to your solicitors claiming non-consummation like a coward, too afraid to admit he'd made a mistake he regretted. That's not... Isn't it? Tell me, Your Grace, what exactly did you find so unbearable about being married to me? Was it the inconvenience of having to consider another person's existence? The horror of coming home to someone who actually cared whether you'd had a difficult day? Or was it simply the reality of intimacy? Real intimacy. Not just the physical act, but emotional vulnerability, proving too much for a man who prides himself on never needing anyone. Each word landed like a blow, and Maximilian had no defense because they were all true. He had been terrified of the way she had looked at him with such trust, such faith that he could be the man she believed him to be, terrified of the domestic expectations he associated with suffocation and loss of self, terrified most of all that he might fail her, might prove unworthy of the love she seemed so ready to offer. So he had destroyed it first, had sought the annulment before she could discover his inadequacies, before he could disappoint her the way he felt certain he eventually would. I was wrong, he said quietly, about all of it. I was a coward, and I hurt you, and I'm sorrier than you can possibly imagine. Sorry. Arabella laughed, the sound bitter and broken. You're sorry. Well, that certainly makes everything better, doesn't it? Your apology will feed my children and pay my rent and erase 4 months of struggling alone while you lived in your Grosvenor Square palace without a care in the world. I would have helped if I'd known. You offered to help after the annulment, Arabella said flatly. Do you remember? You stood in the doorway of that Chelsea house and told me you'd provide a settlement. Make sure I was comfortable. Tch, as if money could compensate for the fact that you'd just legally erased our marriage as though it never happened. As if financial support could make up for emotional abandonment. You refused the money. Of course I refused it. I refused to be bought off, to be made into your charitable obligation. I refused to take money from a man who couldn't be bothered to keep the promises he made to me. Arabella's voice was shaking now, years of suppressed anger finally finding release. You married me, Maximilian. You stood before God and witnesses and promised me your life, your fidelity, your support in all things. And then, 3 weeks later, you decided those promises were inconvenient and paid solicitors to make them disappear. I was afraid, Maximilian said, the admission tearing out of him. I was terrified that I would fail you, that I couldn't be what you needed, that marriage would destroy everything I'd built. So you destroyed it first, Arabella finished. You destroyed us first, before we had a chance to see if we could actually build something real. And when I discovered I was carrying your children, I made a choice. I chose not to trap you into a responsibility you clearly didn't want. I chose to raise them alone rather than force them to have a father who resented their existence. Behind her, one of the babies stirred, making soft sounds that suggested imminent waking. Arabella immediately turned her attention away from Maximilian, moving to the cradle with the practiced efficiency of someone who had learned to anticipate their children's needs before they escalated. Shh, my darling, she murmured, lifting Caroline gently. The baby settled immediately against her mother's shoulder, her tiny fist curling into the fabric of Arabella's dress. Mama's here. You're safe. The tenderness in her voice, the gentle competence with which she held their daughter, made something crack open in Maximilian's chest. This was what he had missed. 4 months of this. Late-night feedings, first smiles, the countless small moments that made up the texture of a life. Let me help now, he said, keeping his voice quiet so as not to disturb Theodore, who still slept peacefully. I know I have no right to ask for anything, but they're my children too. Let me provide for them properly. They don't need your money, Arabella said, still focused on Caroline, who was beginning to fuss in earnest. They need stability and love, and a mother who won't abandon them when they become inconvenient. Those things I can provide. On a seamstress's wages? Arabella, you're barely surviving. We are surviving. That's more than many can say. And we're doing it with our dignity intact, which is worth more than all your wealth combined. Caroline's fussing had escalated to proper crying, and Theodore was beginning to stir in response to his sister's distress. Arabella moved to the rocking chair, settling in with practiced ease, and began nursing Caroline with the unself-conscious efficiency of a woman who had long since stopped caring about modesty in the face of her children's. Maximilian looked away, giving her privacy, and found his gaze drawn to the sewing table where several completed pieces. He moved closer, examining the work. Delicate embroidery on what appeared to be a lady's handkerchief. The stitching was exquisite, each flower and vine rendered with painstaking care, the kind of work that required hours of focused attention. "How much do you earn for a piece like this?" he asked, already knowing he wouldn't like the answer. "6pence, if I'm lucky, 4pence usually." "And how many can you complete in a week?" "6, perhaps 7 if the children sleep well, and my eyes don't give out from the close work." Maximilian did the mathematics automatically. 3 shillings a week at best, perhaps 7 or 8 a year. Barely enough to cover rent, let alone food, coal, clothing, medical care for the children. She was living on the knife's edge of poverty, one illness or accident away from complete destitution. "This is madness," he said, turning back to face her. "Arabella, you're Theodore and Caroline's mother, but you're also—" He stopped, the words catching in his throat. "I'm also what?" Her voice held a dangerous edge. "Your discarded wife. Your abandoned obligation. What exactly am I to you, Maximilian?" "You're still my wife," he said quietly. "Legally, if the annulment was based on false claims, we're still married. The solicitors confirmed it. The existence of children proves consummation occurred, which means the annulment is void." Arabella's face went very pale. "You consulted solicitors about this?" "I consulted everyone I could think of. Arabella, don't you understand what this means? You're not a widow. You're the Duchess of Ashford. Those children aren't illegitimate. Theodore is my heir. Caroline is a duke's daughter. You all have rights, protections, a position in society. I don't want a position in society." Arabella's voice rose enough to startle Caroline, who whimpered against her mother's chest. "I don't want your title or your fortune or your belated recognition. I want what you could never give me. A partner who actually wants to be married, not someone performing a duty to legitimize children he never intended to have." Theodore woke fully then, his cries joining Caroline's in a chorus that filled the small room. Arabella looked torn between her 2 children, Caroline still nursing, Theodore now wailing with the particular urgency that suggested he would not be easily soothed. "May I?" Maximilian asked, already moving toward the cradle. "You don't know how—" "Then teach me," he said, and carefully, slowly, lifted his son for the first time. Theodore was heavier than Maximilian expected, solid and real, in a way that made his heart constrict, with overwhelming emotion. The baby's cries faltered slightly as Maximilian held him against his chest, supporting the small head with awkward but careful hands. "Like this?" he asked Arabella, who was watching with an expression torn between concern and something that might have been reluctant approval. "Support his neck more. Yes, like that. And rock slightly. Not too much. Just a gentle sway. He likes that." Maximilian followed her instructions, and Theodore's cries gradually subsided into confused whimpers as he studied this strange new person holding him. The baby's eyes, unmistakably Ashford grey, tracked Maximilian's face with serious attention, as if trying to determine whether this person could be trusted. "Hello, Theodore," Maximilian said softly. "I'm your father. I know you don't know me, and I've done nothing to earn your trust, but I'm going to try. I promise you, I'm going to try to be worthy of you." Theodore's response was to grab Maximilian's cravat with surprising strength, pulling the expensive silk askew with complete disregard for its Brummel-approved arrangement. The gesture was so utterly ordinary, so perfectly childlike, that Maximilian felt tears prick his eyes. This was his son. This small person with the serious expression and the iron grip was a piece of him, walking around in the world, growing and changing every day, whether Maximilian was there to witness it or not. "He likes you," Arabella said quietly, and there was surprise in her voice. "He doesn't usually settle for strangers. Perhaps he knows," Maximilian suggested. "Some instinct, some recognition of blood. Or perhaps he simply appreciates being held. Babies aren't complicated, Maximilian. They want warmth and food and safety. Everything else we project onto them." Caroline had finished nursing and was now regarding Maximilian with the same serious attention her brother had shown. 2 sets of grey eyes, watching him, judging him, waiting to see what kind of father he would be. "What do you want?" Maximilian asked Arabella, Theodore still cradled in his arms. "Not what you think you should want, not what's practical or proper. What do you actually want for yourself and for them?" Arabella was quiet for a long moment, rocking Caroline gently. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft but clear. "I want them to grow up knowing they're loved unconditionally. I want them to never doubt their worth, never question whether they're wanted. I want them to have opportunities I never had, education, choices, the freedom to become whoever they're meant to be. And for yourself? I want to stop being so tired," she admitted, and the naked honesty of it broke Maximilian's heart. "I want to sleep through the night without worrying whether I can pay next month's rent. I want to not have to choose between buying coal or buying meat. I want—" She trailed off, looking down at Caroline. "I want what I thought I had for 3 weeks. A partner, someone who sees me as more than a problem to be solved or an obligation to be managed." "I see you," Maximilian said. "I always have. That's what terrified me. You saw me too clearly, saw past all the armor I'd built, and I couldn't bear being that vulnerable. Now I'm standing in a Bloomsbury lodging house, holding my son, realizing that every choice I made to protect myself from vulnerability only guaranteed I would miss the most important things in life." Theodore had fallen asleep against Maximilian's chest, his small body relaxed in complete trust despite having no reason to trust this stranger at all. The weight of him, the warmth, the slight baby smell of milk and innocence. It was overwhelming and perfect and utterly terrifying all at once. "I don't know how to do this," Maximilian admitted. "I don't know how to be a husband to someone I hurt so badly, or a father to children I missed the first 4 months of their lives. But I want to learn, Arabella. I want to try." "Trying isn't enough," Arabella said. "Theodore and Caroline deserve more than someone who's trying. They deserve a father who chooses them completely, even when it's difficult, even when it interferes with business or society or whatever else you think matters." "Then I choose them," Maximilian said. "I choose you, all of you, completely, even though I have no idea what I'm doing." "What about Lady Victoria?" Arabella's voice was carefully neutral, but Maximilian heard the hurt beneath it. "Or did you forget you're engaged to London's most desired woman?" The engagement, of course. Victoria would need to be told, would need to understand that everything they had been planning was now impossible because Maximilian was still married to someone else. "I'll speak with her," he said. "Tomorrow, tonight, as soon as I can arrange it. She deserves honesty, even if the truth is devastating." "And what will you tell her? That you forgot you were married? That a wife and children appeared out of nowhere like some gothic novel?" "I'll tell her the truth, that I made vows I tried to unmake, that those vows produced children I never knew about, and that the marriage I thought was ended never actually was. I'll tell her I'm sorry for wasting her time with promises I can't keep." Arabella studied his face for a long moment, and Maximilian could see her weighing his words against his past actions, trying to determine if this transformation was real or simply a temporary emotion that would fade when faced with practical difficulty. "If you do this," she said finally, "if you claim us publicly, it will be a scandal. Society will be vicious. They'll say I trapped you, that I deliberately concealed the children to force you into acknowledging them. They'll whisper that Theodore and Caroline are illegitimate despite any legal arguments to the contrary. You'll be humiliated. I've been humiliated before. I'll survive it. Your business interests might suffer. Associates who value propriety over profit might distance themselves. Then I'll find new associates. Arabella, I've spent my adult life accumulating wealth and power. All of it is meaningless if I'm not using it to protect the people who matter. And we matter. After one afternoon of holding your son." Maximilian looked down at Theodore, still sleeping peacefully against his chest, then at Caroline, who had also drifted off in her mother's arms. Two small people who had existed without him, who would continue to exist regardless of his choices, but who deserved better than a father who only acknowledged them when forced by circumstance. "You matter more than anything else in my life," he said. "All 3 of you. I know I haven't earned the right to say that. I know my past actions prove the opposite. But I'm asking for a chance to prove that people can change, that mistakes can be repaired, that it's never too late to become who you should have been all along." Arabella was crying now, silent tears tracking down her cheeks. "I can't go through this again, Maximilian. I can't let you into our lives, only to have you leave when it gets difficult." Theodore and Caroline deserve stability, not a father who appears and disappears based on his comfort level. I'm not going anywhere, Maximilian promised. Not tomorrow, not next month, not next year. I'm going to be here, learning how to be a father, making mistakes undoubtedly, but never giving up. You have my word. Your word. Arabella laughed through her tears. The word of a man who promised me his life and then legally erased our marriage 3 weeks later. The word of a man who has finally understood what actually matters. The word of a father who wants to know his children. The word of a husband who never stopped being married, even when he tried to pretend he was. The room was quiet, except for the soft breathing of 2 sleeping babies. Outside, London continued its evening business. Thousands of people going about their lives, unaware that in this small Bloomsbury lodging house, a family was being assembled from broken pieces. If you do this, Arabella said finally, there's no going back. You can't acknowledge them today and then change your mind next week when society makes it difficult. You can't be their father only when it's convenient. I understand. And you can't buy their love with expensive gifts or grand gestures. They need presence, not presents. Time, not money. I understand that too. And us? Arabella hesitated, looking down at Caroline. Whatever we were, whatever we might become, that has to develop slowly, naturally. I won't be forced into playing the devoted wife for society's benefit when the truth is far more complicated. We'll take it as slowly as you need, Maximilian agreed. I'm not asking you to pretend everything is resolved between us. I'm just asking for the chance to prove I can be different than I was. Arabella was quiet for a long time, studying his face as if searching for something. Finally, she nodded. All right, you can visit them. Not every day. That would be too disruptive. But regularly. You can learn who they are. Let them learn who you are. We'll see if your promises hold when faced with reality. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't even trust, really. But it was a chance. And Maximilian would take it. Thank you, he said quietly. I know I don't deserve this opportunity. I'll try to be worthy of it. Don't try, Arabella corrected. Either do it or don't. Theodore and Caroline don't need someone who tries. They need someone who commits. Theodore stirred in Maximilian's arms, making soft baby sounds as he shifted toward waking. His small face scrunched up, preparing for a cry, and Maximilian instinctively began the gentle rocking motion Arabella had taught him. There, Arabella said, and something in her voice had softened slightly. You're learning already. As Maximilian rocked his son, watching his daughter sleep in her mother's arms, he realized that this ordinary moment in a modest room with nothing grand or impressive about it, was what success actually looked like. Not the Grosvenor Square mansion, or the railway investments, or the power that came with a dukedom. This, family, love, the terrifying, overwhelming, wonderful responsibility of being someone's father, someone's husband, someone who mattered not for his title or wealth, but simply for being present. He had spent 32 years learning how to accumulate power. Now he would spend however long it took, learning how to be worthy of the small people who had just entered his life. And if society was scandalized, if business associates questioned his judgment, if his carefully constructed independence crumbled under the weight of domestic responsibility, well, he would survive it. Because some things were worth any price, and Theodore and Caroline, and Arabella, were worth everything. The conversation with Victoria took place the following afternoon in the drawing room of her family's Belgrave Square residence. Maximilian had requested a private audience, and Victoria's mother, a woman of excellent breeding and even better instincts, had withdrawn with remarkable tact after offering tea that neither of them would drink. Victoria sat on the settee in a gown of pale lavender that complemented her colouring perfectly, every inch the ideal aristocratic bride. But her sapphire eyes held concern as she studied Maximilian's face. You look as though you haven't slept, she observed. Should I be worried? Yes, Maximilian said bluntly. He had spent the night wrestling with how to explain the unexplainable, how to confess that their entire courtship had been built on a foundation of legal fiction. In the end, he had decided that Victoria deserved the truth, unvarnished and complete. I need to tell you something that will change everything between us. Victoria's posture straightened slightly, her social training keeping her expression pleasant even as wariness entered her eyes. That sounds ominous. I'm married, Maximilian said, the words emerging stark and brutal. Or rather, I'm still married. To a woman I thought I had divorced, annulled, legally, more than a year ago. But the annulment was based on claims that have proven to be false, which means it's void. Which means our engagement is impossible, Victoria finished, her voice remarkably steady. Because you're already married to someone else. Yes. The silence that followed was profound. Victoria's hands remained folded in her lap, her expression controlled, but Maximilian could see the minute trembling of her fingers, betraying the emotion she was working so hard to contain. How long have you known? She asked finally. Since Tuesday. When I saw her in the street and realized. He stopped, uncertain how much detail Victoria wanted or needed. I've spent the past 3 days confirming what I already knew in my bones. She had my children, Victoria. Twins. A boy and a girl. I never knew she was pregnant when the annulment went through. She never told me. Children. Victoria's voice was very quiet. You have children. Theodore and Caroline, 4 months old. And their mother, Arabella, has been raising them alone in Bloomsbury on a seamstress's wages while I've been courting you and planning a future that was never actually available to me. Victoria stood and moved to the window, her back to Maximilian, her shoulders rigid with carefully controlled emotion. When she spoke again, her voice carried the particular tone of someone working very hard to maintain composure. You must think I'm remarkably foolish. All those months of courtship, all the planning, the announcements to family, and you were married the entire time. I didn't know. Didn't you? Victoria turned to face him, and for the first time since he'd known her, genuine anger coloured her usually pleasant features. You knew you'd been married, even briefly. You knew the annulment was based on claims that might not withstand scrutiny. Yet you courted me, proposed to me, let me plan a future with you without once mentioning that your previous marriage might not be as ended as you claimed. The accusation was fair, and Maximilian had no defence. You're right. I should have told you about the annulment, about Arabella. I convinced myself it was ancient history, irrelevant to our future. I was wrong. Were you in love with her? This woman you married and discarded so quickly. The question caught Maximilian off guard. Was he in love with Arabella? Had he been during those 3 brief weeks? He thought about her exhausted face in the lodging house, the fierce protectiveness with which she held their children, the way she had refused his money because she valued her dignity more than his wealth. I don't know, he admitted. I was something. Overwhelmed, perhaps. Terrified of the intensity of it. I ran from her because what we had felt too big, too all-consuming. I couldn't control it, couldn't compartmentalize it the way I did with everything else in my life. And me? Victoria's voice was very soft. What was I to you? Safe, Maximilian said, and saw her flinch at the honesty. You were everything I thought I wanted after Arabella. Intelligent but undemanding. Beautiful but uncomplicated. You never made me feel vulnerable or overwhelmed. You were the perfect partner for a man who was terrified of actually being partnered with anyone. Victoria's laugh was bitter. How flattering. I was the perfect refuge for a man running from his own emotions. Victoria, no, it's actually rather clarifying. I always wondered why you chose me when you seemed so emotionally distant. Now I understand. You chose me precisely because I wouldn't demand emotional intimacy you weren't capable of providing. I was safe because I was superficial. That's not what I meant, isn't it? Victoria moved back to the settee but didn't sit, instead standing behind it with her hands gripping the upholstered back. You know what the worst part is? You're not wrong. I was safe. I never asked difficult questions, never pushed for deeper conversations, never demanded to know what you were thinking or feeling beyond the surface pleasantry. I was so focused on being the perfect duchess, gracious and pleasant and undemanding, that I forgot to be a person with my own needs and desires. You're a remarkable woman. I'm a remarkably stupid woman who allowed herself to be courted by a man who was never actually available. But at least now I understand why you seemed relieved whenever I didn't press for emotional intimacy. You weren't capable of it, and I was too foolish to see it. Maximilian wanted to argue, to defend himself, but the words died in his throat because Victoria was right. He had chosen her specifically because she wouldn't push him toward the kind of vulnerability that Arabella had demanded simply by existing. I'm sorry, he said, knowing it was inadequate. You deserved better than this, better than me. Yes, I did. I do. Victoria's voice strengthened, anger giving way to something harder and more resolute. And perhaps this is the gift you've given me, Maximilian, the knowledge that I deserve someone who actually wants to know me, not just someone who appreciates my decorative qualities and my lack of emotional demands. You'll make some man very happy, Maximilian offered, and immediately realized how condescending it sounded. Victoria's smile was sharp. Yes, I will. Some man who actually wants a wife, rather than an ornamental business partner. Some man who isn't still legally married to someone else. The engagement ring, a sapphire the size of a robin's egg, surrounded by diamonds, caught the light as Victoria pulled it from her finger. She held it out to Maximilian with steady hands. I believe this belongs to you, along with all the promises that came with it. Maximilian took the ring, the metal cold and impersonal in his palm. The settlement we discussed. I don't want your money, Victoria interrupted. I want my dignity intact and my future unencumbered by association with a scandal that's about to consume you. Because it will, you realize. When society discovers you've been married this entire time, when they learn about the children, the gossip will be vicious. I know. And you're prepared for that? Prepared to have your name dragged through every drawing room in London? To be snubbed at clubs and whispered about at balls? If that's the price of claiming my family, then yes. Victoria studied his face for a long moment, and something in her expression shifted from anger to something that might have been grudging respect. You really do love them, the wife you abandoned, and the children you never knew about. This isn't just guilt or obligation. You actually want them in your life, more than anything else in the world. Then I hope it's worth it, Victoria said, and there was genuine feeling in her voice rather than bitterness. I hope Arabella is everything you need, and that your children bring you joy, because you're giving up a great deal for them. Reputation, social standing, the life you've carefully constructed. Those things never made me happy, Maximilian realized aloud. They made me successful and respected and envied. But happiness, that requires vulnerability I was never willing to risk. Until now. After leaving Victoria's residence, Maximilian felt the weight of what he had just done settle onto his shoulders. A broken engagement, a woman hurt by his deception, and the certainty that within hours the gossip would begin spreading through London like wildfire. But underneath the guilt and apprehension was something else, a lightness he hadn't felt in years. As if by finally claiming the truth of his circumstances, he had released himself from a cage he didn't even realize he'd been trapped in. He directed his driver not to Grosvenor Square, but back to Montague Street. There were practical matters to discuss with Arabella, living arrangements, financial support, how to present their situation to society. But more than that, there were his children waiting, and Maximilian discovered he was eager to see them again, to continue learning who they were. The scandal broke within 48 hours, erupting across London society with the force of a financial panic. The Duke of Ashbourne, it was whispered in every drawing room and club, had been married all along. Not just married, but the father of twin bastards. No, wait, legitimate children, technically, though the circumstances were so irregular that legitimacy felt like a technicality rather than a certainty. The broken engagement with Lady Victoria added fuel to the fire. Had she known? Had she been deceived? Was she heartbroken or relieved to escape such a tangled situation? The gossip was merciless, but Maximilian weathered it with a calm that surprised him. He released a formal statement through his solicitors, explaining that his marriage to Mrs. Arabella Ashford had never been properly dissolved, and that he was delighted to acknowledge his son Theodore and daughter Caroline as his legitimate heirs. Any questions regarding the matter could be directed to his legal counsel. The statement was a masterpiece of understatement that admitted everything while explaining nothing, and it made society's collective heads spin with frustrated curiosity. More practically, Maximilian moved Arabella and the children from Bloomsbury to a townhouse in Belgravia, not the Grosvenor Square mansion, which felt too much like imposing his will, but a smaller, more intimate residence that could actually function as a home rather than a monument to wealth. Arabella had resisted at first, arguing that she didn't want to be dependent on his generosity, that accepting his help felt like surrender. But Maximilian had finally convinced her by pointing out that Theodore and Caroline deserved better than watching their mother work herself to exhaustion, that accepting help for their sake wasn't weakness, but wisdom. The Belgravia house became a kind of middle ground. Neither the poverty of Bloomsbury nor the overwhelming grandeur of Grosvenor Square. It had a nursery that Maximilian had furnished with perhaps excessive enthusiasm, a garden where the children could eventually play, and enough space for Arabella to have rooms of her own where she could retreat when the weight of their complicated situation became too much. Maximilian visited daily, learning the rhythms of infant care with the same focused intensity he had once brought to business ventures. He discovered that Theodore hated baths but loved being read to, even though he couldn't possibly understand the words, and that Caroline was fascinated by music and would stop crying immediately if someone sang to her, that both children slept better when they could see each other, as if the awareness of their twin provided essential comfort. And slowly, carefully, he began rebuilding something with Arabella that was neither the passionate intensity of their brief marriage nor the polite distance of strangers. It was something new, a partnership built on shared responsibility for two small people who needed them both. They argued about practical matters, how much staff the house required, whether to hire a nurse or manage the children themselves, what social obligations Arabella should be expected to fulfill as a duchess. They disagreed about discipline strategies for children who wouldn't need discipline for years yet. They debated the merits of country versus city life for raising children. But they also laughed sometimes, usually at Theodore's solemn expression when trying something new or Caroline's imperious demands for attention. They shared the exhaustion of sleepless nights and the triumph of small milestones, the first real smiles, the day Theodore held his head up unassisted, the afternoon Caroline rolled over on her own, and very gradually, Maximilian began to understand what he'd been so afraid of during those 3 weeks, not Arabella herself, but the vulnerability required to truly let someone know him, the terror of being seen completely, flaws and fears and all, and risking rejection once the true self was revealed. But caring for Theodore and Caroline made hiding impossible. They saw him at his worst, exhausted, uncertain, making mistakes constantly. And they loved him anyway, with the uncomplicated devotion that only children could offer. And Arabella saw him struggling and didn't judge, only helped. Saw him fail and didn't criticize, only showed him better ways. Saw him gradually becoming the father he should have been from the beginning, and acknowledged the effort even when the results were imperfect. 6 months after that afternoon when Maximilian had seen Arabella in the street, he sat in the Belgravia garden watching Theodore and Caroline play on a blanket spread across the grass. They were 10 months old now, no longer the tiny infants he had first met, but small people with distinct personalities and preferences. Theodore was cautious and observant, studying everything carefully before deciding whether to touch it. Caroline was bold and exploratory, grabbing whatever caught her interest with enthusiastic disregard for potential consequences. Arabella sat beside him on the garden bench, her hand resting near his on the wooden seat. Not touching exactly, but close enough that he could feel the warmth of her presence. "They're extraordinary," he said, as he often did, still amazed by the reality of his children. "They're ordinary," Arabella corrected, as she usually did. "Every parent thinks their children are extraordinary, but yes, they're perfect." "Thank you," Maximilian said quietly, "for letting me be part of this, for giving me a chance I didn't deserve." Arabella was quiet for a moment, watching Theodore try to pull himself into a sitting position with Caroline's help, which consisted mostly of grabbing his hair with both hands. "You're not the same man who sought an annulment," she said finally. "That man was terrified of vulnerability and convinced that needing people was weakness. This man," she gestured at Maximilian, at the grass stains on his expensive trousers from playing with the babies, at the way he watched their children with such obvious devotion. "This man has learned that strength comes from loving people enough to risk being hurt by them." "I still get it wrong sometimes," Maximilian admitted. "Still want to solve problems with money instead of presence. Still struggle with the messiness of emotions. Everyone struggles with. The difference is you're trying, actually trying, not just performing, trying for appearances." Caroline had discovered a flower and was attempting to eat it, despite Theodore's apparent protest. Maximilian stood to intervene, carefully extracting the flower from his daughter's surprisingly strong grip and enduring her outraged cries at having her prize removed. "Everything is a negotiation with you," he told her, settling her against his shoulder, where her cries subsided into disgruntled mumbling. "You're going to be formidable when you're older. I pity the man who tries to marry you without understanding what he's getting into." "Like her father did?" Arabella asked, but there was humor in her voice rather than accusation. "Exactly like her father. who has since learned that formidable women are worth the terror they inspire. Later that evening, after the children were asleep and Arabella had retired to her sitting room with a book, Maximilian found himself in his study, not the grand room in Grosvenor Square, but the smaller, more comfortable space in the Belgravia house. Staring at the portrait of the Northumberland coal mine that had once represented his greatest achievement, it seemed almost laughable now that he had once measured success by such limited metrics. Wealth acquired, power accumulated, independence maintained, all of it meaningless compared to the weight of Theodore falling asleep in his arms, or Caroline's delighted laughter when he played peekaboo with increasingly ridiculous faces. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Arabella stood in the doorway, wrapped in a dressing gown that was far more practical than fashionable, her auburn hair loose around her shoulders. "I thought you'd retired," Maximilian said. "I couldn't sleep. And I thought we should discuss something. What's wrong? Are the children? The children are fine. This is about us." Arabella moved into the room but didn't sit, instead standing near the window where moonlight caught in her. "We've been living in this strange limbo for 6 months. Married, but not really together. Co-parents, but not truly partners. And I think we need to decide what we're actually doing." Maximilian's heart began to hammer against his ribs. "What do you want?" "I want to know if you're staying because you love Theodore and Caroline, or because you're obligated to stay. I want to know if this," she gestured between them, "is friendship or marriage or something else entirely that we haven't named yet." "What if I don't know the answer?" Maximilian admitted. "What if I'm still figuring out the difference between loving you because you're my children's mother and loving you because you're you? Then be honest about that." "I don't need declarations of eternal devotion, Maximilian. I need honesty. I need to know where I stand so I can make informed choices about my own life." Maximilian stood and crossed to where she stood, close enough to touch, but not touching. "I know that I think about you constantly when I'm not here. I know that seeing you with Theodore and Caroline makes my chest tight with something that feels like gratitude but bigger. I know that I want to tell you about everything that happens in my day, even the boring parts, because your opinion matters more than anyone else's." That could be friendship. It could be. But friends don't spend hours thinking about whether someone's hand might eventually accept being held. Friends don't lie awake wondering if someone might someday want to be kissed again. Arabella's breath hitched slightly. "Maximilian, I'm not asking for anything," he said quickly. "I know I have no right to ask, but you wanted honesty, and the honest truth is that I'm falling in love with you. Again, or maybe still, or possibly for the first time properly, now that I'm not too terrified to feel it." "You're not terrified anymore." "I'm absolutely terrified, but now I understand that being terrified and doing it anyway is the only path to anything worth having." Arabella looked at him for a long moment, her grey-green eyes reflecting the moonlight. Then, slowly, she reached out and took his hand. "I'm terrified too," she admitted. "Terrified of letting you in completely and being hurt again. Terrified of building a life with you and discovering you still can't handle vulnerability. Terrified that this fragile thing we're building will shatter under the weight of reality." "Then we'll be terrified together," Maximilian said, squeezing her hand gently. "And maybe someday, if we're very lucky and very brave, we'll be less terrified and more certain." "I'd like that," Arabella said softly. "Someday." They stood there in the moonlight, hands joined, two people who had found each other twice, once in passion that burned too bright to sustain, and again in the slower, steadier flame of shared purpose and growing trust. It wasn't the grand romantic gesture that stories were made of. It was quieter than that, more complicated, more real, but it was theirs, and that made it. Epilogue. 2 years later, the garden at the Belgravia house had been transformed by 2 years of careful attention. What had once been a modest yard now boasted a small playground where Theodore, now 2.5 years old, pushed his sister on a swing with the serious concentration he brought to all tasks. "Higher!" Caroline demanded, her auburn curls flying as the swing arced through the air. "Not too high," Arabella called from the bench where she sat with Maximilian, watching their children with the constant low-level vigilance that all parents developed. "Remember what happened last time you went too high? She fell and got right back up," Maximilian observed. "Our daughter is remarkably resilient." "She gets that from you," Arabella said, and when Maximilian looked at her in surprise, she smiled. The stubbornness, the refusal to be defeated by setbacks, the absolute certainty that she can accomplish anything she sets her mind to. That's pure Ashford determination. And Theodore's caution and observation, where does that come from? His father, who spent a year carefully studying how to be a parent before allowing himself to believe he was capable of. But they had fallen into the habit of these conversations, small moments of analysis and appreciation for the small people they were raising. Theodore had his father's eyes and his mother's thoughtfulness. Caroline had her mother's colouring and her father's intensity. Both had inherited stubbornness from both parents, which made discipline an ongoing adventure in negotiation. The scandal that had erupted 2 years ago had faded to distant memory, replaced by new gossip and fresh scandals. Society had eventually accepted that the Duke and Duchess of Ashford were indeed married, that their children were indeed legitimate, and that the circumstances, while irregular, were no longer interesting enough to merit constant discussion. Maximilian had stepped back from some of his business obligations, restructuring his holdings to allow for time with his family. The coal mines still produced wealth, the railway investments still generated returns, but he no longer measured his worth by the size of his fortune. Instead, he measured it by the weight of Caroline falling asleep on his chest during afternoon naps, by Theodore's proud announcement that he had learned a new word, by Arabella's hand finding his during evening walks through the garden. "I received a letter from Victoria," Arabella said, pulling an envelope from her pocket. "She's engaged. To Lord Hartwell's son, the one who writes poetry." "Good," Maximilian said, meaning it. "She deserves someone who appreciates her for more than her decorative qualities. She says in the letter that she's grateful to you for breaking their engagement, that it forced her to examine what she actually wanted in a partner, rather than what society expected her to want. That's gracious of her." "It is. She also says she'd like to call on us when she's next in London, if that would be acceptable." Maximilian considered this. 2 years ago, the thought of facing Victoria would have been unbearable, a reminder of his failures, his deceptions. Now it simply felt like an opportunity to demonstrate that past mistakes didn't have to define future relationships. "I think that would be lovely. You'd like her, actually. She's whip-smart and has excellent taste in literature. So, unlike your current wife, who prefers sensational novels to serious philosophy." "My current wife," Maximilian said, pulling Arabella closer, "has excellent taste in everything, including her choice to give me a second chance I didn't deserve." "You're rather persistent about not deserving things you clearly work very hard to deserve." Before Maximilian could respond, Theodore came running over, his face serious. "Papa, Caroline won't share the swing. Tell her she must take turns." "Did you ask nicely?" "I said my turn now, very politely." "That's not quite the same as asking," Arabella observed. "Try saying, 'May I have a turn, please?' and see if your sister responds better." Theodore considered this carefully, then nodded and returned to the swing set, where Caroline was still demanding to go higher, despite the absence of anyone to push her. "They're going to be a handful when they're older," Maximilian observed. "They're a handful now." Imagine Theodore's cautious perfectionism combined with Caroline's fearless determination once they start school. "Should we have more?" The question surprised them both. Arabella turned to look at Maximilian fully, studying his face. "More children? Is that something you'd want? I realize we're only just finding our footing with these two, but I thought—" He trailed off, uncertain how to explain the desire he hadn't realized he felt until the words emerged. "You want more children," Arabella said slowly, wondering in her voice. "The man who sought an annulment to escape domestic responsibility now wants a larger family. The man who sought an annulment was an idiot who didn't understand that responsibility could also be joy. This man," Maximilian gestured at himself, at the grass stains on his trousers and the toy blocks in his pocket. "This man has learned that the best parts of life are the ones that demand everything from you." Arabella was quiet for a long moment, and Maximilian worried he had pushed too far and assumed too much about the stability of what they had rebuilt. "Ask me again in a year," she said finally, "when Theodore and Caroline are old enough to be slightly less exhausting, and when I'm certain this isn't just temporary enthusiasm that will fade when faced with actual sleepless nights and endless nappies." "Fair enough." Maximilian pulled her closer, pressing a kiss to her temple. "I'm a patient man. I've learned to be." "You're a transformed man," Arabella corrected. "The patient part is still a work in progress." They sat together as afternoon stretched into evening, watching their children play with the unself-conscious joy that only small children possessed. Theodore had successfully negotiated a turn on the swing and was now pushing Caroline with careful precision. Caroline was singing some song only she knew the words to, her voice carrying across the garden like a small bell. "Do you ever regret it?" Maximilian asked quietly. "Refusing my money after the annulment, struggling alone. Everything you went through because I was too cowardly to be the man you needed. Every day for the first 6 months," Arabella admitted. "But then I held Theodore and Caroline and realized they were worth any struggle. And eventually, you showed up and started trying to be the man they needed, which turned into you becoming the man I needed as well. So, no, I don't regret it. Every choice led here, and here is exactly where I want to be." As darkness fell and they herded 2 protesting children inside for baths and bedtime stories, Maximilian reflected on the strange journey that had brought him to this moment. From that afternoon in the carriage with Victoria, seeing Arabella in the street with 2 babies, feeling his carefully constructed life crack apart, to now, standing in a modest house with grass-stained clothes and exhausted children who demanded one more story, one more glass of water, one more kiss goodnight. He had thought success meant freedom from obligation. Now he understood that success meant having obligations worth fulfilling, people worth showing up for, children who needed him to be present, not perfect. After the children finally slept, Maximilian found Arabella in the sitting room, working on embroidery, not for money now, but for pleasure. "They're asleep," he reported, settling beside her on the sofa. "Finally, Theodore needed 3 stories, and Caroline insisted I check for monsters in every corner of the nursery. Were there any monsters? Only the ones she'll have to face eventually: fear, doubt, the cruelty of people who judge without understanding. But those can wait. Tonight, I vanquished imaginary creatures and assured her that Papa would always keep her safe." "Will you?" Arabella asked. "Always keep her safe." "I'll try. That's all any parent can do. Try to protect them, prepare them, love them enough that they have strength to face whatever comes." Arabella set down her embroidery and turned to face him fully. "Maximilian, I need to tell you something." His heart jumped. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong. Everything's right, actually. But I think we should have a proper wedding. We are married. Legally, yes, but not in any way that counts emotionally. We were married in a rush by a stranger, then had that marriage annulled, then discovered it wasn't actually annulled. We've been living together for 2 years, raising our children, rebuilding our relationship, but we've never actually chosen each other deliberately, with full knowledge of what that means." Maximilian understood what she was asking. Not a legal ceremony, they didn't need that, but a symbolic one, a public declaration that their marriage was not just a technicality, but a genuine choice. "You want to get married again. I want us to stand before people who matter and make promises we actually intend to keep. I want Theodore and Caroline to witness their parents choosing each other. I want to start our real marriage properly." "Yes," Maximilian said immediately. "Yes to all of it. When?" "Soon, before I lose my nerve or convince myself it's silly to marry someone you're already married to." Or, they planned the ceremony for the following month, keeping it small, family, and genuine friends only. No society obligations or political necessities, just the people who had supported them through the scandal and aftermath. When the day came, Arabella wore a dress of cream silk that showed she was expecting their 3rd child, a revelation that had come just weeks after their garden conversation, suggesting that perhaps the universe had a sense of timing after all. Theodore carried the ring on a small cushion with intense concentration. Caroline scattered flower petals with enthusiastic disregard for the aisle they were meant to stay within, and Maximilian stood at the front of the small chapel, watching his wife walk toward him for the 2nd time, and felt none of the panic that had gripped him during their first ceremony. Only certainty, only gratitude, only the profound understanding that sometimes the greatest success comes from admitting you were wrong and being brave enough to try again. "I promise," he said, when the moment came for vows, "to show up every day even when it's difficult, to be present for the boring moments and the beautiful ones, to admit when I'm wrong and try to do better, to love you and Theodore and Caroline and whoever else joins our family with everything I promise," Arabella replied, her eyes holding his, "to trust you even when it's scary, to give you the chance to prove yourself again and again. to build this life with you as partners, not as people fulfilling obligations, and to remind you, whenever necessary, that vulnerability is strength, not weakness. Theodore clapped enthusiastically at what he thought was the end of the ceremony. Caroline announced loudly that she was hungry, and both parents laughed, because this was family, imperfect, messy, loud, and absolutely worth every sacrifice, every moment of terror, every risk they had taken to be here. Later, at the small reception in their garden, Maximilian stood with Arabella watching their children play with cousins and friends, one hand resting gently on her slightly rounded stomach, where their third child grew. "No regrets?" he asked. "About which part? Marrying you twice? Having your children? Giving you a second chance?" "Any of it." Arabella smiled, that genuine smile that lit her entire face and reminded him why he had been so terrified of loving her. Because losing something this good would destroy him. No regrets. "You?" Maximilian looked at his family, at Theodore showing a younger cousin how to properly wind a toy, at Caroline trying to teach another child her incomprehensible song, at Arabella glowing with pregnancy and happiness beside him, at the life they had built from broken pieces and second chances. "Only that I wasted so much time being afraid of this, but I suppose that makes me appreciate it more now." "Good answer," Arabella said, squeezing his hand. "You're learning." "I'm trying." "Trying is good, but doing it is better." And Maximilian Ashford, Duke of Ashford, who had once measured success by wealth and power and independence, smiled at his wife and their children and understood finally that he had found the only success that actually mattered: the love of people worth loving, the chance to be better than he was, and the grace to accept that he deserved happiness, even when he had done so little to earn it. It was enough, more than enough. It was everything.